As we continue to track the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in Puerto Rico, it's worth noting a couple of things, including the fact that officials at the United Nations have suggested that Puerto Rico's debts be forgiven so that people can concentrate on rescuing people from the aftermath of the hurricane. And when we talk about debt, we normally, in many cases, are treated in the media as if it were a faceless thing, as if it were somehow a force of nature. But debt is owned by individuals and organizations. In the case of Puerto Rico and other governments, state, local, and national, it is often an instrumentality of exploitation. So it's good to know who the people are who are being, in some cases, prioritized over the needs of the people in Puerto Rico. And my next guests have conducted a very useful investigation on the debt holders, the holders of Puerto Rican debt. It was a joint investigation between In These Times and Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, it was published in These Times. The reporters who join us now: Alex Hernandez, who is an assistant editor at In These Times; Carla Minet, who is a journalist and editor at the Center, which could be translated as the Center for Investigative Journalism. Her work has appeared in a number of places, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Univision, and El Nuevo Dia. So they both join us now by Skype. Alex and Carla, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
Good to have you. So your piece was entitled, the headline it was given in These Times was "Who Owns Puerto Rico's Debt?" Exactly. We've tracked down 10 of the biggest vulture firms. Let's start with this. What do we mean in the context of Puerto Rico when we talk about vulture firms? Carla?
Well, when we started investigating about who owned the debt in Puerto Rico, for a very long time we were making lots of questions that nobody answered. We even got to court at one point to ask the government to release the names of the owners of this debt. And finally, during the bankruptcy process, we have been able to see the names of most of these owners of the debt. And we have gotten to the conclusion that most of them are vulture funds.
Now, Alex, when we use a term like vulture fund, what does that mean, just for our listeners who might not know?
Yeah, and that's actually something that came up a lot during our reporting, where there was lingo and jargon in the financial world that's purposely obtuse, so the general public has a hard time understanding. Specifically for vulture firms, these are hedge and private equity funds that specialize in high-risk debt. So essentially, they look for things that are distressed, that are on the verge of collapse, or are already in the middle of a bankruptcy. They purposely invest in that, and then these types of vulture firms, hence their name, actually cater specifically to millionaires and billionaires.
So what happens then, just to round that out, if I understand correctly, is that these vulture firms swoop in on struggling or distressed governments, or for that matter, corporations, but in this case, state government. They, to round that out, they buy its debts cheaply. And then they, in many cases, especially in Puerto Rico, my understanding is they use political influence to make sure that their debts, which benefit millionaires and billionaires, are prioritized over more urgent public needs. Is that a fair statement, Carla, you think?
Well, it's just that most of these firms are trying to, show to the government and to the court that they represent small bondholders, but other than the mutual funds, which are other kinds of firms, the Vulture firms really represent millionaires who have to invest at least 1 million, 5 million, 20 million, $25 million to be able to get into as part of the Vulture Fund and buy debt from Puerto Rico in this case. So it's not they are not representing small bondholders. That's one of the issues we explain in the story. They are representing multimillionaire,
which is very important. Yeah, when you're talking about leaving people without electricity, and it turns out that you're doing it in order to give priority to multimillionaires, that's something that people need to know. And just to stay with the subject of what people need to know for a second, Carla, your center, the Center for Investigative Journalism, went to court in July 2015 because the Government Development Bank of Puerto Rico was not releasing this information. What is their justification for keeping this information so secret? Isn't this something the public has a right to know?
At different points, the government said that it was confidential information. We think that mostly they were trying to protect the possibility of a negotiation, a voluntary negotiation, before they went to the bankruptcy court. But in general, let's say that these are very private firms. They do not disclose the information of what they own or where they own debt or any kind of holdings in general. Some of them have even shell companies that they create in order to invest. So it's a very, it's a world of a lot of secrecy. The hedge fund investment world, especially the Vulture, which are those who know they are going into distress debt and that there is going to be a possibility of the government not paying very shortly, and they still go out and they still bet big.
So, Alex, in your report also, you talk about the report that you and Carla found. You talk about Puerto Rico's debt and the fact that a lot of that is interest, and that financial firms like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, the ones who help structure Puerto Rico's debt, built in what you guys call astronomically high interest rates, and that by this point nearly half the debt, $33.5 billion, is interest. Who does that interest get paid to?
That would be the bondholders. Essentially, the easiest analogy I can come up to when you're looking at a near equivalent outside of cities and state governments is offering a mortgage to a homeowner with extremely bad credit, knowing full well that the amount of income that person has, their credit rating is extremely low, and that by loaning them that money, you're going to have a very high interest rate to protect yourself as a lender. However, all of these Vulture firms, and the other non-Vulture firms as well, they lended that money to Puerto Rico, knowing full well it was extremely risky. To give an example, Puerto Rico's junk bond sale was the largest in U.S. history. To date, period. That was in 2014. And then when it declared bankruptcy in May, that was also a historical thing because that was the largest municipal bankruptcy in the U.S. So knowing full well that they were selling or giving money to a municipality with a junk bond rating, they went there with eyes wide open, knowing they could possibly lose all their money. To give context, you talked about the $74 billion in debt and the $49 billion in pension obligations that Puerto Rico has. Back in 2013, when Detroit declared bankruptcy, they only had $18 billion in debt.
So we're talking about a massive amount of debt, a massive amount of which is interest. We're talking about also Puerto Rico, as you guys mentioned, as we have covered on this show, there was a U.S. appointed fiscal control board that was allowed to make many decisions about how Puerto Rico spends its money. And many of us felt that was a very Wall Street friendly board in many ways. They've imposed, even before the hurricane, severe austerity on Puerto Rico, furloughs and layoffs or furloughs at least of government employees, increases in utility bills, school closings, and so on. Now, in the wake of the hurricane, are people there getting the expenditure on rescue and rebuilding they need? If not, how much does this debt and this appointed board or any other aspect of this debt prevent people from getting the help they so urgently need right now?
Definitely the austerity measures that have been going on for the past 3 or 4 years, even maybe longer, definitely have affected the way the government has responded to this emergency. I would say that most of the country, more than 30% of the country, still has no electricity, and many problems have arisen from the cuts in employees, the government furlough, and different kinds of expense cutting in the agencies. Hospitals have not been prepared during this emergency. A lot of people have died, and definitely the country in general has not been able to get any kind of normality since the hurricane passed. Right now, I am in an office at the university where we are, but this is like a miracle happening right now that we have electricity and we have internet connection. This is not the reality for most people in Puerto Rico right now.
Yes. What percentage of the island now is without power?
It's the government is using very flawed numbers because they are using the consumption, generation and consumption numbers. But in terms of clients using electricity is less than 30%. So
we have more than 70% of the people of Puerto Rico are still without electricity, is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
And we have thousands of people still living in shelters, cell towers, cell phone access still down, that kind of thing? Definitely.
Most cell companies are not even 50% of their performance. Shelters still have around maybe 2,000 or 3,000 persons on shelters. More than 250,000 houses lost their roofs, and a lot of people still don't even have any kind of materials to cover their roofs, at least partially, until they can do something more permanent. So there is still water shortage in most of the mountainous region. There is food distribution problems. So yes, it's we are still living in the crisis mode that we had 4 weeks ago.
And sure, go ahead.
It's kind of impressive too. Carla and her team began this investigation 5 months before the hurricanes hit. During the hurricane thing, her team not only were continuing this investigation, but were also pursuing the stories on the ground, what was happening in Puerto Rico. We lost contact with them for a good chunk of time before or right after the hurricane hit, Hurricane Maria hit. Once we established contact with them, we were like so grateful they were okay. But to show a parallel of that, these financial firms we're talking about, they were filing motions in the digital docket as the hurricane was making landfall as well. So they did not stop their very aggressive pursuit of being paid back the debt while these hurricanes hit. And they've continued to do this as the island struggles to recover.
So one of the really important things I think your report does, and I encourage everyone to read it, is it names the firms and it names the leadership of the firms, because I think it's important for people to be held accountable for that kind of behavior, which to me, I find, that's a matter of opinion, of course, and you're a journalist, but I find it immoral. I find it indefensible. So I want to encourage people to read your piece. And what are you guys, are you guys continuing this investigation further?
Yes, we are. We actually have a story that went up on November 2nd that gives a little bit of context onto the history of this. In these times, back in the 1970s, a Puerto Rican economist wrote a story basically pointing out that the dominoes that led to this current financial collapse were set up decades ago. Even in the 1970s, economists were saying that Puerto Rico's economy, the way it's set up, which is mainly through tax breaks to corporations and manufacturers and relying on low-wage labor, was not self-sustaining in any way, shape, or form. That came to a head when Puerto Rico declared bankruptcy in, I believe, in May. And then additionally, we have a new story that's a more in-depth continuation of the investigation coming out on Monday, which I believe is November 6th.
Well, we will have to have you back to talk about that. You guys are doing fantastic work, so I thank you for that work and what you've discovered for the rest of us, and Alex Hernandez and Carla Minet. I thank you very much for coming on the program as well.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and by the way, you can find the report on In These Times, and this is The Zero Hour.